Case 1. Amelia D. Stasio. September 28, 2017. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There are moments in the work of law enforcement that leave a permanent mark on every officer, every first responder, and every investigator who encounters them. Moments that cannot be unseen, cannot be unfiled, and cannot be forgotten no matter how many years pass. September 28, 2017, was one of those moments for the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What firefighters discovered inside a quiet Southside apartment building on that Thursday morning was the kind of evidence that changes a person professionally and personally. It was the kind of case that would eventually draw national headlines, spark conversations about mental health, about parental responsibility, about the invisible warning signs that communities sometimes miss, and about the devastating price paid by the most innocent and vulnerable among us when those warning signs go unaddressed. Milwaukee is a city of neighborhoods. It is a city of front porches and corner stores, of community cookouts and church bells, of working families and longtime residents who know their neighbors by name. It is also, like every major American city, a place where people quietly struggle behind closed doors, with poverty, with mental illness, with isolation, and with circumstances that social systems are sometimes too slow to recognize or too under-resourced to address. The apartment building near 17th and Grant was one such place. Residents came and went. Neighbors kept to themselves. And for 2 months, a young mother and her 4-year-old son had been living there, largely unnoticed, largely unknown, largely unreached by any of the support systems that might have intervened before everything fell apart. Her name was Amelia D. Stasio. She was 23 years old. By all observable accounts from the outside world, she was simply a young single mother raising her son in a modest apartment. But behind that door, something was deeply, profoundly wrong. Something that investigators would later connect to a severe and untreated break from reality, a descent into a terrifying and distorted belief system that would cost her son his life. The morning of September 28th began like any other on that block. Residents were waking up, getting ready for work, preparing for the day. Then the smell of smoke began to filter through the building hallways. A neighbor noticed it first, then another. Someone looked toward the apartment near the end of the hall and saw wisps of dark smoke curling from beneath the door. Emergency services were contacted immediately. When the Milwaukee Fire Department arrived and forced entry into apartment number 2, they encountered a scene that would require immediate police involvement. Smoke was rising from the stove, and in the bathroom, investigators located what initially appeared to be smoldering clothing in the bathtub. Within moments, it became clear that what lay in that bathtub was not clothing. It was 4-year-old Antonio D. Stasio, the only child of Amelia D. Stasio, and he had not survived. The criminal complaint that followed described what investigators found in that bathroom in clinical but devastating detail. Antonio's hands and arms had been secured to his sides using 7 belts. A plastic bag had been placed over his head and pulled tight, knotted at the back. The medical examiner's report confirmed significant thermal injuries to the majority of his small body, and investigators determined that an accelerant had been used to set the fire. A bottle of canola cooking oil was found on the bathroom sink. The apartment's smoke detector had been removed from the wall and submerged in water, a deliberate act that ensured no alarm would sound in time to alert neighbors. In the bathroom, next to the bathtub, investigators found a pet guinea pig, Antonio's companion animal, drowned in its cage. Every detail of that scene pointed to something calculated, something deliberate, something that defied every instinct of parental love and protection. And yet the investigation that followed would reveal a story of such profound psychological collapse that the legal system itself would be forced to grapple with some of the most complex questions at the intersection of mental illness, criminal accountability, and justice. In the days and weeks before Antonio's death, there had been warning sounds that neighbors heard but perhaps did not fully understand. One resident of the building, who had spoken with investigators after the discovery, recalled hearing Antonio's voice through the thin apartment walls the day before he passed away. She remembered him saying, clearly and desperately, "Please, Mommy, stop. I won't do it again." She heard his mother's voice respond sharply, "Shut up." The following morning, the same neighbor recalled hearing a banging noise coming from the apartment. She had not called authorities. She had not knocked on the door. Like so many of us, she had hesitated, unsure whether what she was hearing constituted an emergency, unsure whether it was her place to intervene. It was a hesitation that she would carry with her long after that terrible morning. When Amelia Stasio was not found inside the apartment after emergency services arrived, officers immediately began searching for her. A second witness reported seeing a woman, described as looking frazzled, climb from the windowsill of the apartment building and flee the scene. Law enforcement began canvassing the area. Later that same day, September 28th, an officer spotted Amelia Stasio walking along West Wisconsin Avenue, several miles from the apartment. She was crying. She was in distress. And she had, earlier that morning, approached a couple waiting at a bus stop near 35th and Wisconsin and asked them a desperate question. Did they know a pastor? She needed to speak with someone, she told them. She had done something terrible. She had never did nothing like that before. The couple, moved by her apparent anguish, gave her a handwritten note with the name and phone number of a woman who might be able to help. A Christian woman, the husband explained, who might be willing to listen. That note was still in Amelia Stasio's purse when officers apprehended her and took her into custody. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence that would be central to the legal proceedings. Evidence that painted a picture not of a calculating, cold criminal, but of a young woman in the grip of a terrifying and undiagnosed psychotic break. A search of Amelia Stasio's cell phone revealed that on the morning of September 28th, the same morning her son's life was taken, she had searched for the phrase, "How do cannibals die?" and "How to kill a cannibal." The misspellings were phonetic, suggesting the searches had been conducted in a state of extreme agitation. Her phone also contained browsing history connected to a message board dedicated to an online horror survival game in which players battled cannibals. That message board had discussed how to eliminate cannibals within the game's fictional universe, and it specifically recommended fire as the method. It noted that in the game, cannibals like to bathe in oil. When investigators and later a forensic psychologist interviewed Amelia Stasio, a profoundly disturbing picture emerged. She told the psychologist that she had believed her son was a cannibal or a vampire. She believed, with complete conviction, that Antonio was going to harm her, that he was not the innocent 4-year-old child that the rest of the world saw, but a supernatural threat that she had to neutralize to survive. The psychologist testified that Stasio had been suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of her son's passing, and that at the moment she committed her actions, she was entirely unable to distinguish right from wrong. She was not, in the clinical and legal sense, in contact with reality. Antonio Stasio's grandfather, Ralph Stasio, Amelia's own father, spoke to the press in the aftermath of his grandson's passing. His words were heartbreaking in their simplicity and their grief. "It's impossible to describe it," he said. "I got to hope that Antonio is in heaven." Antonio had autism. He had been a child who, according to family, was always smiling. He had been a child with challenges, yes, but also with joy, with presence, with a future that was taken from him before he ever had the chance to live it. He deserved protection. He deserved care. He deserved a life. And the system, despite the evidence now visible in hindsight, had not been able to reach his mother in time. In October of 2018, the case came before a Milwaukee County judge for a final legal determination. The forensic psychologist testified at length about Amelia Stasio's mental state, both at the time of Antonio's passing and in the period that followed. The judge accepted the testimony and ruled that at the time of her actions, Stasio was legally insane, that she had been unable to comprehend the wrongfulness of what she was doing. As a result, she was not convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. Instead, she was committed to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where she will spend the remainder of her life under psychiatric care. There is no sentence that restores a child's life. There is no ruling that undoes what happened in that bathroom on 17th and Grant. Antonio Stasio was 4 years old. He had his whole world ahead of him. His case is a reminder of something that advocates and mental health professionals have been saying for decades, that untreated severe mental illness, especially when combined with isolation, limited support systems, and a vulnerable child in the home, can become a deadly combination. Antonio deserved someone to reach his mother before that morning arrived. And every community must ask itself, honestly and urgently, whether it is doing enough to make sure that reach happens in time. Antonio Di Stasio, 4 years old. May his memory endure, and may his story continue to drive the conversation about child protection, mental health intervention, and the irreplaceable value of every young life. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges, or if you have concerns about a child's safety in your community, please reach out to the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. That's 1-800-422-4453. Help is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If this case has moved you, if it has made you think about the children in your own community and the systems that are meant to protect them, then please take a moment right now to like this video. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Your support keeps this channel going and keeps these important conversations alive. Justice for every victim begins with people who are willing to pay attention, and you are one of those people. Case 2, Katie Koch, July 13, 2023, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. On a warm summer afternoon in a quiet residential neighborhood on Milwaukee's west side, something happened that would stop an entire community in its tracks. It began with a phone call to 911, then another, then several more, all from neighbors along South 71st Street who were witnessing something that none of them had words for, something that looked, at first glance, like it could not possibly be real. 2 small boys, unclothed, walking down the middle of the street, their hair matted beyond recognition, their bodies bearing the evidence of what investigators would later describe as years of chronic neglect and confinement. They moved with a bewildered, stumbling gait that neighbors would later struggle to describe. They were not playing. They were not misbehaving. They were escaping. And they had escaped through a broken window, a shattered pane of glass that had been, until that moment, one of the only barriers separating them from the outside world. A 13-year-old girl who was among the first witnesses described the 2 brothers in words that would be repeated in courtrooms, in news broadcasts, and in the public consciousness for months to come. They were, she said, acting like cavemen, like they had never seen the sun before. Christine Eder, a neighbor who lived directly across the street, called 911 while keeping her eyes fixed on the 2 children. She would later describe to reporters the precise moment she processed what she was seeing. They were just walking differently, she said. Their hair looked like it had never been brushed, never been cut. They didn't know the outside existed. She paused, and then added, "I'm not going to ever forget the way they looked when they came running out of that house. Never forget that." The look on their faces was pure bewilderment. They were just looking all around. I don't think they'd ever been outside before. The boys were 7 and 9 years old. They were brothers. And the home from which they had escaped, a house on South 71st Street in the Bluemount Heights neighborhood of Milwaukee, had been, for years, their entire universe. Not in the warm, nurturing sense. Not in the sense of a loving home where children are sheltered and raised. In the most literal, most confining, most desolate sense of the word. That house had been their world because they had not been allowed to leave it. When Milwaukee police officers and medical personnel arrived, what they encountered inside that home defied easy description. The criminal complaint filed in Milwaukee County Circuit Court described the residence as a terrible hoarding situation in which officers could not see the floor. The walls of the children's room, the room where the boys had spent the overwhelming majority of their young lives, were documented as being covered, nearly every inch of them, in human waste. The windows of their room had been boarded shut. The door had been fitted with a latch on the outside, a latch that could only be engaged from the hallway, not from within the room. The boys had been locked inside. Milwaukee County Assistant District Attorney Mallory Davis would later stand before the court and describe the conditions in the language of someone who had reviewed the photographs and still could not quite believe what they depicted. "It's really terrible," she said. "It's like something out of a horror movie." The children were essentially confined to their room for much of their lives. And the door had a latch on the outside, and the windows were boarded shut. Almost every inch of their walls was covered in human feces. When the 2 brothers were taken to the hospital for evaluation, medical staff discovered conditions that reflected years of neglect. The boys had not received medical attention in over a year. They were not potty trained, not at 7, not at 9. They were described by Assistant District Attorney Davis as completely uneducated and essentially at this point unable to function in society. Their hair had to be shaved at the hospital because it was so severely matted with feces that it could not be detangled. When authorities contacted the boy's mother, Koch, 34 years old, to inform her that her children's heads had to be shaved at the hospital because of the condition of their hair, her response reportedly was that it was okay because they needed a haircut, and yeah, whatever they need to do. It was a response that encapsulated what investigators and prosecutors would describe as a profound and sustained failure of maternal responsibility, a failure that had stretched across years, not days. Koch had been living in the Bluemount Heights home with her 2 sons and her boyfriend, Joel Mankey, for approximately 3 years. Neighbors who were interviewed after the children's escape uniformly expressed shock, not just at what the boys had endured, but at the fact that they had never even known children were living in the house. In 3 years of residing across the street, beside, and near that property, not a single neighbor had seen those boys outside. Not once. Absolutely nothing. Christine Eder told reporters when asked what she knew about Koch and her boyfriend. "I never saw her or him. Ever." The investigation revealed that the boys had been, in the language of the criminal complaint, prisoners. Their room was their cell. The boarded windows ensured they had no view of the outside world, no access to natural light, no connection to the neighborhood around them. The latch on the door ensured they could not leave without permission. And permission, it appeared, was rarely, if ever, granted. Koch was arrested and charged with 4 felony counts and 2 misdemeanors, including chronic neglect of a child and false imprisonment. Joel Mankey, her boyfriend, was charged with 4 felony counts. When Koch appeared in Milwaukee County Intake Court on July 17, the court commissioner was presented with a case that the prosecution described as one of the most disturbing child welfare situations the county had encountered in recent memory. Cash bail for Koch was set at $30,000. A public defender noted that Koch had no money to post bail. In a particularly telling moment, investigators revealed that Koch had written a 3-page letter to her sons following her arrest, an apology letter, in which she acknowledged that they deserved better. The existence of that letter demonstrated an awareness, at least in the aftermath, of the harm that had been done. Whether that awareness had ever existed in the years prior, in the months and years during which those boys had lived behind boarded windows and latched doors, was a question the court would be left to consider. The legal proceedings moved through the system over the following months. The house itself, the physical structure in which 2 children had spent their formative years in conditions that shocked investigators who had seen much in their careers, was eventually sold. A neighbor, Rick Eder, watched as cleanup crews descended on the property weeks after the arrest. "You could just smell the inside of that house all the way to the street," he said. It was that bad. In February of 2024, Koch was sentenced in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Judge Rebecca Kiefer presided over the sentencing hearing, and her words upon pronouncing the sentence reflected the gravity of what the court had considered. This was a prison of garbage and filth that these poor children were made to reside in, the judge said. Koch was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Joel Mankey received the same sentence in subsequent proceedings. Perhaps the most important postscript to this case is the one that comes from a video recorded in January of 2025, a video that prosecutors presented to the court at Mankey's sentencing hearing. In that video, the 2 brothers, who had been placed in a fully staffed foster home following their rescue, were shown playing, speaking clearly, and interacting normally with a detective. They were shaking hands. They were laughing. Judge Kiefer, viewing the footage, was visibly moved. "It is so nice to see these 2 young men acting in this way," she said, because the court remembers the circumstances of their escape in July of 2023. Those boys are healing. They are growing. They are, for the first time in their young lives, experiencing the kind of childhood that every child deserves. The sunlight, the fresh air, the freedom that was denied to them for so long behind those boarded windows. Their names have not been publicly released, as is appropriate for child victims. But their story has been told, and it must continue to be told, as a reminder of what can happen when children fall through the cracks of visibility, when communities don't know their neighbors, when no one asks the simple question, "Where are the children?" Koch and Mankey will both be in prison until those boys are adults. By the time they are released, the children they can find will have grown into men who will carry the extraordinary burden and resilience of what they survived. The justice system delivered accountability. But the deeper lesson of this case is about community, about the importance of knowing who lives around you, about noticing when children are absent from a neighborhood, and about understanding that silence is not always peace. If this story has affected you, if it has reminded you of the importance of looking out for the children in your community, please consider supporting organizations that advocate for child welfare. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline remains available at 1-800-4-CHILD, 24 hours a day. And please, if you found value in this story, if you believe that these cases deserve to be heard and these victims deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video. Every subscription is a statement that you care about justice, that you care about children, and that you believe the truth matters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. This community grows because of viewers like you. Case 3. Iraida Pizarro-Osorio. September 4th, 2019. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There are cases that arrive in a courtroom already carrying the weight of 100 unanswered questions. Questions about how. Questions about when. Questions about why no one intervened sooner. Questions about what a child endured in the silence of a locked bedroom, in the absence of adequate food, in the isolation of a body that had been failing for longer than anyone outside those walls had been allowed to see. The case of Iraida Pizarro-Osorio and her son Hector is that kind of case. A case that demands those questions be asked loudly, publicly, and without flinching. On September 4th, 2019, a 32-year-old Milwaukee woman named Iraida Pizarro-Osorio brought her 16-year-old son to the 16th Street Health Center on Milwaukee's South Side. According to court documents and the criminal complaint filed in Milwaukee County Circuit Court, the boy, Hector J. Pizarro, arrived at the clinic unresponsive. Staff described him as having a faint pulse and appearing extremely emaciated. Despite the immediate and desperate efforts of clinic personnel and Milwaukee first responders who rushed to the scene, Hector did not survive. He was 16 years old. He weighed 42 pounds. To understand the full magnitude of that number, 42 pounds, consider what the criminal complaint included for context. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's growth charts for boys between the ages of 2 and 20, Hector's weight at the time of his passing placed him in the 0th percentile. The 0th percentile. There was no measurable cohort of American boys his age who weighed less. A detective who responded to the scene that day noted, in the official complaint, that the teenager's skeletal structure was visible underneath the skin, and that he was lacking muscle. He had, in the language of the medical examiner's autopsy, no fatty tissue. Multiple severe ulcers were found on his right hip, and left shoulder, the kinds of wounds that develop in individuals who are immobile, malnourished, and unable to reposition themselves. Hector Pizarro had a chromosome disorder. He had epilepsy. He had autism. He had the mental capacity, according to his mother's own statements to investigators, of a small child. He could not walk toward the end of his life. He crawled to move from one place to another. He was entirely dependent, physically, cognitively, emotionally, on the adult in his life who was supposed to care for him. That adult was his mother. What investigators uncovered in the days following Hector's passing revealed a story of sustained and catastrophic neglect. Neglect that stretched back not months, but years, and neglect that had been flagged to the system multiple times without resulting in the intervention that Hector needed. The Milwaukee Child Protective Services had received referrals related to concerns about Hector's nutrition on 3 separate occasions between 2016 and 2018. In December of 2017, Hector had been hospitalized following a severe seizure, and concerns about malnutrition had been formally noted. At that point, the Bureau of Child Welfare had become involved, assigning caseworkers to visit the home regularly for a 6-month period to monitor Hector's weight. By 2018, his weight had improved, reportedly rising to approximately 68 to 70 pounds under that supervision. And then, for reasons that remain incompletely explained in the public record, the monitoring was discontinued. In the 16 months between the end of that supervision and the morning Iraida Pizarro-Osorio carried her son to that health clinic, Hector Pizarro lost more than 25 pounds. He went from a monitored, improving child to a dying one, and no one from the child welfare system saw it happening. When investigators searched the family home following Hector's passing, They made a discovery that became central to the criminal case. A chain lock had been installed on the outside of Hector's bedroom door. A lock that could only be engaged from the hallway. A lock that, placed on the outside of a room belonging to a child who could not walk, who could not fully communicate, who relied entirely on adult care, could serve only one functional purpose: to keep him inside. Pizarro-Osorio offered an explanation for the lock during her initial interview with police. She said she would feed Hector his dinner, then lock his bedroom door at bedtime to prevent him from crawling out of his room at night. She claimed that she would reopen the door once he fell asleep so that she could hear if he suffered a nighttime seizure. It was an explanation that investigators found deeply inconsistent with the other evidence they were gathering. An 18-year-old woman who was also interviewed by police, identified in court documents only by her age, gave a different account. She told investigators that in March of 2019, 6 months before Hector's death, Pizarro-Osorio had placed a lock on the outside of Hector's door to prevent him from leaving his room at night. This same witness also contradicted another of Pizarro-Osorio's claims. The mother had told police that she had recently traveled to Puerto Rico with her children, that Hector had become ill there, and that Puerto Rican doctors had refused to treat him because she lacked insurance. The witness told investigators that this trip had never taken place. When confronted with this information in a second police interview, Iraida Pizarro-Osorio admitted that she had lied. She and her children had never traveled to Puerto Rico during the summer of 2019. When asked why she had fabricated the story, she gave an answer that illuminated the fear at the center of her choices, a fear that, while understandable in a narrow human sense, could not excuse what Hector had endured. She said she was afraid that if Child Protective Services were called again, her children would be taken away from her. She had been afraid of losing her children, and in her fear, she had done the very thing that most warranted intervention. She had allowed her most vulnerable child, the one who could not speak for himself, who could not call for help, who could not describe what was happening to him, to deteriorate in a locked room until there was nothing left to save. Iraida Pizarro-Osorio was charged with one felony count of chronic neglect of a child with great bodily harm as a consequence. The charge carried a potential sentence of up to 25 years in prison. She entered a not guilty plea. The case proceeded through the Milwaukee County court system. What happened at sentencing became, in the years following, a matter of significant public controversy. Judge Janet Pertasiewicz, who would later run for a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, sentenced Pizarro-Osorio to no prison time. The decision prompted immediate and sustained criticism from victim advocates, law enforcement professionals, and members of the public who felt that the outcome failed to reflect the severity of what Hector Pizarro had endured. Critics pointed to the repeated CPS referrals, the locked door, the deliberate deception of investigators, and the sheer physical evidence of Hector's condition as factors that, in their view, demanded a more serious consequence. Regardless of where one stands on that sentencing decision, the facts of Hector Pizarro's life and passing remained unchanged. He was a young man with profound disabilities who was entirely dependent on the care of an adult who failed him, not once, not briefly, but consistently and severely over a period of years. He weighed 42 pounds at 16. His bones were visible through his skin. He had sores on his body from immobility. He spent his nights in a locked room. And when he finally stopped being able to survive the conditions of his life, he was brought to a clinic too late for anyone to save him. The case of Hector Pizarro is, above all, a case about the children who cannot advocate for themselves. Children with disabilities. Children who cannot tell a teacher what is happening at home. Children whose needs are complex and whose circumstances make them invisible to the systems that are theoretically designed to protect them. Hector's story must be remembered, not as a story of a broken system in isolation, but as a call to action for every institution, every caseworker, every neighbor, and every community member to remain vigilant about the children who have no voice. Rest in peace, Hector J. Pizarro. You deserved so much better than the world gave you. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that children like Hector deserve to have their stories told with the dignity and seriousness they deserve, please like this video. Sharing this content helps raise awareness and keeps the conversation about child protection alive. Hit the notification bell. Together, we are a community that refuses to look away. Case 4. Zakquita Joyner Murphy. November 6, 2025. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Some cases arrive in the news cycle and stay there, lodged in the collective consciousness of a community not because they are the most complex or the most legally intricate, but because they are the most heartbreaking. Because at their center is someone so small, so young, so utterly without the capacity to protect themselves, that the weight of what happened to them is simply impossible to set aside. The case of 3-year-old Daquarius Berry is that kind of case. A little boy, a life just beginning, and a set of circumstances that, when laid out in a criminal complaint, left a Milwaukee County Court commissioner visibly shaken. Daquarius Berry was 3 years old, still at the age when children are learning to speak in full sentences, when they are discovering the world through touch and curiosity, when the presence of a safe and loving caregiver is not a luxury, but a biological necessity. He lived with his mother, Zakquita Joyner Murphy, 34 years old, and her boyfriend, Marcus Jenkins, in a home near 29th Street and Concordia Avenue on Milwaukee's north side. Joyner Murphy had 5 children in total, all of whom lived in the home. She worked as a bartender at a local establishment called Kickback. She was, by the accounts presented to the court, the primary caregiver for all 5 children. On the night of November 5, 2025, and into the early morning hours of November 6, what happened in that home, and more precisely, what did not happen in that home, set in motion a chain of events that would end with Daquarius being pronounced deceased at Children's Wisconsin Hospital at 8:41 in the morning. According to the criminal complaint, Joyner Murphy left her home on the evening of November 5 at approximately 10:30 in the evening to pick up her boyfriend, Marcus Jenkins. The two returned briefly, then left again at approximately 1:30 in the morning to go to Kickback, where Joyner Murphy was scheduled to work. They remained at the bar until approximately 5:30 in the morning. During the entirety of that time, from approximately midnight on November 5 through 5:45 in the morning on November 6, Joyner Murphy's 5 children, including 3-year-old Daquarius, were left alone in the home with no adult supervision. Joyner Murphy had told investigators initially that a woman named Peaches, who lived in the upstairs apartment, had been checking on the children. When investigators spoke with Peaches, she told them she had been staying at her grandmother's home from November 5 through November 7 and had not been at the apartment complex at all during that period. When confronted with this information, Joyner Murphy confirmed, according to the criminal complaint, that she had in fact left her 5 children home alone and unsupervised from approximately midnight through the early morning hours. When Joyner Murphy returned home in the early morning of November 6, she described to investigators a sequence of events that culminated in the discovery of her youngest child in a critical state. She said she had taken a shower after returning, then gone to check on Daquarius. When she reached him, she described his body as limp. His mouth was filled with a foamy mucus. She picked him up. His heartbeat was faint. She screamed for Jenkins, who was asleep in the bedroom, and he called 911. Joyner Murphy began performing CPR on her son. First responders arrived and transported Daquarius to Children's Wisconsin. Medical staff at the hospital conducted an examination and found what the criminal complaint described as a large hemorrhage in Berry's abdomen that would have been caused by non-accidental trauma. The language of the complaint used to describe the nature and severity of those injuries was pointed and unambiguous. The injuries sustained by Daquarius show that the actor acted with complete and utter disregard for human life. Daquarius Berry passed away at 8:41 in the morning on November 6, 2025. He was 3 years old. On November 15, 2025, Zakquita Joyner Murphy made her initial court appearance in Milwaukee County, wearing an anti-suicide monitoring garment. She was charged with 1 count of child neglect resulting in the passing of her child. Cash bond was set at $50,000. Milwaukee County Court Commissioner J.C. Moore, in the brief remarks he delivered from the bench at that initial appearance, captured the essence of what made this case so devastating. "I am confronted by an extremely serious case," he said, "involving the passing of a child as a result of a significant injury to the abdomen and substantial internal bleeding with very limited explanation in the criminal complaint except that the child was under the care of Ms. Joyner Murphy." The criminal complaint noted, with deliberate care, that as of the time of its filing, Joyner Murphy was identified as one of two suspects who had the opportunity to cause the injury to Aquarius's abdomen. The investigation remained ongoing. Jenkins, Joyner Murphy's boyfriend, had been arrested at the hospital, though on a probation violation, rather than on charges directly related to the child's passing at the time of the initial filing. If convicted on the charge of child neglect resulting in passing, Zakquita Joyner Murphy could face up to 25 years in prison. As of the time this documentary was produced, the case remained in active judicial proceedings. Aquarius Berry deserved the most fundamental thing that any child deserves: the protection of the adult responsible for his care. He was 3 years old. He had a whole life waiting. The investigation into his passing continues, and the community of Milwaukee, and the broader community of anyone who watches this case unfold, awaits accountability for what happened to him in those dark morning hours when he was left without protection. His name is Aquarius Berry. He was 3 years old, and he mattered. If this case has moved you, if you believe that every child deserves safety, protection, and the presence of a responsible caregiver, please take a moment right now to like this video. Your engagement helps this channel continue to bring these important stories to the people who need to hear them. Hit the notification bell. Thank you for being part of this community. Case 5, Mary Cano. January 2018 through April 2022. Crawford County, Wisconsin. Some of the most enduring questions in child welfare are not about the dramatic, sudden moments, the emergencies, the crises, the events that trigger immediate 911 calls. The most enduring questions are about duration, about how long something can go on inside a home, behind a closed door, within a family, before the outside world becomes aware. About how children can spend years, not days, not weeks, but years, experiencing conditions that would shock the conscience of any reasonable person, while life continues to move forward normally for everyone around them. The case of Mary and Casey Cano of Crawford County, Wisconsin, is a case about duration. It is a case that spans 4 years, from January of 2018 through April of 2022. 4 years during which 6 children, the youngest of whom was an infant and the oldest of whom was 9 years old, were subjected to conditions of physical abuse, starvation, and deprivation so extreme that, when investigators finally documented what those children had experienced, the charges filed against their parents numbered in the dozens. Crawford County is situated in the southwestern corner of Wisconsin, a largely rural area of rolling bluffs and river valleys. The small town of Gays Mills, where Casey and Mary Cano made their home, is the kind of community where people know their neighbors, where the population is small enough that unfamiliar faces are noticed and familiar faces are trusted. It is not the kind of place where people expect to find a household where 6 children were denied food for days at a time, where punishment was administered with a belt that left welts and broke the skin, where children too hungry to endure their confinement were reduced to eating what they could find: mold, insects, grass, the contents of the family dog's bowl, simply to get something into their starving bodies. Casey Cano, 38 years old, and Mary Cano, 35 years old, were each charged with 6 counts of repeated physical abuse of a child causing great bodily harm and 6 counts of child neglect. Each of them also faced 1 count of causing a child under the age of 13 to view or listen to a sexual act. The charges, described in criminal complaints obtained and reviewed by multiple news outlets, painted a picture of a household in which fear, pain, hunger, and isolation were the defining features of daily life for every child in that home. According to the complaints, the abuse began when some of the children were as young as 3 months old. Investigators and prosecutors alleged that from January of 2018 through April of 2022, the Canos repeatedly subjected their children to physical discipline with a belt, discipline that was not corrective in any recognizable sense, but punitive in a manner that caused visible, documented physical harm. The belt left welts. It broke skin. It was used on children who were too young to fully understand why they were being hurt. But the physical harm was not the most harrowing element of what those children endured. The deprivation of food, the systematic, deliberate withholding of basic nourishment as a form of punishment, was, in many ways, the most psychologically devastating aspect of their experience. The children described to investigators a reality in which they were prevented from eating for multiple days at a stretch. They described the hunger as unbearable. They described reaching a point where the drive to eat something, anything, overrode every other impulse. And so they ate what was available. They ate mold. They ate insects. They ate grass from outside the house. They ate from the dog's food bowl. These were not children acting out or being mischievous. These were children in the grip of a hunger so severe that it had stripped away everything except the most basic biological imperative: survive. One of the children, investigators noted, was forced on at least one occasion to wear a diaper for 3 days without it being changed, used as a form of punishment. The details of that particular allegation, in the context of everything else those children experienced, speak to a household in which control, humiliation, and deprivation were systemic and deliberate. The children were removed from the Cano home in April of 2022, not initially because of the physical abuse and neglect described above, but because of a separate legal matter. Both Casey and Mary Cano had, in 2022, been charged with the repeated sexual assault of a 12-year-old child who was not among their own children. Casey Cano entered a no-contest plea to that charge and received a sentence of 10 years in prison with all but 1 year suspended, along with 5 years of probation. Mary Cano entered a guilty plea to the same charge and received a 5-year prison sentence with all but 90 days suspended. It was the removal of the 6 children from the home in connection with that case that first placed them in contact with investigators who could hear their full accounts. What those children described, the belt, the food deprivation, the mold, the insects, the grass, the dog food, triggered a new and separate investigation that would not be formally launched until December of 2025. Both Casey and Mary Cano were arrested in March of 2026 and charged with the full battery of new offenses. Both were released on bond. Casey's set at $2,000, Mary's at $1,000, and their next court date had not been scheduled at the time this documentary was produced. The legal modifier attached to Mary Cano's charges is one that deserves careful attention because it illuminates one of the most morally complex questions that runs through cases like this one. Mary's charges carry a party to a crime designation, meaning that prosecutors allege she did not actively initiate all of the alleged abuse, but that she witnessed it, was present for it, knew about it, and chose not to stop it. In the legal framework of Wisconsin criminal law, that choice, the choice to remain silent, to not intervene, to allow harm to continue, is itself a crime. That is a profound and important legal and moral principle. Bystander responsibility, the responsibility of an adult present in a home where children are experiencing harm to take action rather than to comply through silence, is not simply an ethical ideal. It is, in the state of Wisconsin, a criminal standard. Mary Cano knew what was happening to her children. She was in that home. She saw the belts and the wounds and the hunger. And the law holds that her failure to protect her children, her choice to allow the pattern to continue, makes her complicit. 6 children spent 4 years in conditions that no child should ever experience. They are now in the care of the child welfare system, and one can only hope that they are receiving the support, the therapeutic care, and the stability that will allow them to begin the long process of healing. The road for children who have experienced chronic, prolonged abuse and neglect is not a short one. But children are extraordinary in their resilience, and with the right support, healing is possible. The case of Mary and Casey Cano is a reminder that child abuse does not only happen in sudden, dramatic moments. It can happen slowly, quietly, and consistently, in houses that look normal from the outside, in families that interact with the wider world without drawing suspicion. It is a reminder that the question, "Where are the children?" is always worth asking, and that the answer, when it finally comes, sometimes reveals a reality that has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. If you found this story important, if you believe that no child should ever have to eat from a dog bowl because an adult has chosen to deny them food, please show your support by liking this video. Share this content with your community. These stories matter. These children matter. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's keep fighting for every child who cannot fight for themselves. Case 6, Sarah Kairys. May 25, 2017. Sentenced January 19, 2021. Green Bay, Wisconsin. There are cases in law enforcement that become the standard by which subsequent cases are measured. Cases that investigators carry with them throughout the rest of their careers. Not because they are the most legally complex, not because they end with the most dramatic verdict, but because of what they revealed about the limits of a child's endurance, about the responsibility of a parent, and about the devastating consequences of choosing a romantic partner's comfort over a child's safety. In Brown County, Wisconsin, the county in which Green Bay sits, the case of the 15-month-old daughter of Sarah Kairys became that kind of case. When investigators and prosecutors later described it in court, they did not search for dramatic language. They used language that was almost restrained in its plainness, and that plainness made it more devastating, not less. They described it as one of the worst cases of child abuse they had ever seen. Not one of the most complicated, not one of the most unusual, the worst. The case began on May 25, 2017, when Milwaukee police were called to St. Mary's Hospital in Green Bay. A 15-month-old girl had been brought to the emergency department by her mother, Sarah Kairys, and Kairys' boyfriend, Juan Maravilla. The child was already gone when she arrived. A police officer who responded to the scene and entered the room where the child lay noted, in language that would later appear in the criminal complaint, what they observed immediately upon seeing the girl. I could see that the child was covered in bruises all over its body, varying size and color. The bruises were not limited to one area. They were distributed across the child's body, a pattern that spoke not to a single incident, but to a sustained pattern of harm. What the autopsy revealed extended the picture even further into territory that investigators would describe as shocking even by their considerable professional experience. The 15-month-old girl had suffered multiple fractures, including 2 broken ribs. She had what appeared to be bite marks on her body. She had injuries that had resulted in a perforated bowel, an internal injury of significant severity. The autopsy concluded that the child had died of blunt force injuries to the head and the torso. And crucially, the injuries showed multiple stages of healing, meaning that they had not all occurred at once. They had accumulated over time. Sarah Kairys, 30 years old at the time, was the child's mother. Juan Maravilla was her boyfriend, a registered sex offender who, as a condition of his parole, was not legally permitted to reside at Kairys' townhouse on Western Avenue because of the presence of children. He did not officially reside there, but investigators discovered, through the course of the investigation, that he had been there, regularly, possibly every day. The initial story that Kairys offered to investigators followed a familiar pattern, the story of an accident, of a fall, of something that could not have been foreseen. She told police that her daughter had fallen down the stairs. Maravilla, when first interviewed, supported that account, initially claiming he had not been present when the fall occurred. But the stories did not hold. Investigators noted that Kairys and Maravilla were both very vague with their explanations, and their recollection of time was also quite a bit off as they would change times after consulting with one another. The accounts shifted, contradicted each other, and were inconsistent with the physical evidence documented by the medical examiner. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. Kairys, in a subsequent interview, began to move away from the accident narrative. She acknowledged that she had noticed her daughter getting more bruises lately. She said Maravilla had told her the bruises were from falls. She described how, in the week before her daughter passed away, she had observed the bruises becoming darker. She had noticed her daughter crying a little more. She had seen the bruising around the child's eyes getting darker. And she had, in what investigators and prosecutors would later describe as a catastrophic failure of maternal protection, done nothing. She had not taken her daughter to a doctor. She had not removed her child from proximity to the man she believed was responsible. She had watched her daughter deteriorate and had chosen silence. On the night her daughter passed away, Kairys told investigators that she and Maravilla had been watching movies on the couch together. Maravilla went upstairs to put the 15-month-old to sleep. At some point later, Kairys found her daughter crying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Investigators eventually secured a full account from Maravilla himself. He admitted to striking the child. He demonstrated the manner in which he had done so. He became emotional and shouted, in words that appear in the criminal complaint, "I didn't mean for this. I didn't want her to go." And according to a cooperating informant who had been housed in jail with Maravilla, the boyfriend had made an even more damning admission in that setting. describing how, a week before the child's passing, he had kicked her in the head. Juan Maravilla was convicted of first-degree reckless homicide. In August of 2020, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Brown County Judge John Zakquita called what had happened to that 15-month-old girl torture. 24 years. For what he did to a child who could not speak her own name in full sentences. A child who was still learning to walk. Sarah Kairys was charged with child neglect resulting in the passing of her daughter, child abuse by failure to prevent bodily harm, and resisting or obstructing an officer. She eventually entered a no-contest plea to the neglect charge. The other charges were dismissed but read into the record, meaning they remained part of the documented history of the case even as the formal prosecution narrowed. On January 19, 2021, she stood before Judge John Zakquita for sentencing. He ordered her to serve 10 years in prison, followed by 10 years of extended supervision. The sentence was not an abstraction. It was the court's formal acknowledgement that Sarah Kairys had held information that could have saved her daughter's life. She had seen the signs. She had noticed the darkening bruises and the changing behaviors. She had suspected Maravilla, and she had chosen not to act, had chosen, it appeared, her relationship over her daughter's survival. That child's name has not been publicly released, in keeping with the protective practices applicable to child victims. But her story, the story of a 15-month-old girl who was brought to a hospital already gone, covered in evidence of what had been done to her, is a story that must be told. Not to sensationalize, not to shock, but to remind every parent, every adult with a child in their care, every person who suspects that something is wrong in a home near them, that the choice not to act is itself a choice. And that choice has consequences. The justice system delivered its verdict. 10 years for Sarah Kairys. 24 years for Juan Maravilla, a judge who called it torture. A community that watched and processed and struggled to understand how something like this could happen to someone so small. She was 15 months old. She mattered. And her story is not forgotten. Thank you for staying with this case to the end. If this story moved you, if it made you more determined to be the person who speaks up, who asks the question, who makes the phone call, please like this video. Hit the notification bell. These stories survive because you share them. These victims are remembered because you take the time to listen. Case 7, Sharon Windey. February 12, 2018. Sentenced January 15, 2020. DePere, Wisconsin. Not every case that shocks a community fits the profile that most people carry in their minds when they think about child welfare failures. Not every case involves poverty or chaos or the visible markers of dysfunction that neighbors and teachers are trained to look for. Some of the most devastating cases of child abuse in American legal history have taken place in clean, organized homes. In neighborhoods where houses are well-maintained and children attend good schools. In families that present to the world a portrait of stability, of faith, of order. The Windey family of DePere, Wisconsin, was that kind of family, or appeared to be. Sharon Windey was a retired Wisconsin state trooper. She and her husband, Donald Windey, attended church. They had a biological son named Stephen. And they had, over the course of more than a decade, adopted 4 children. Children with special needs. Children who came to them through the foster care system. Children who needed stability and love and the kind of patient, committed parenting that the adoption process theoretically screens for. What those children actually received, over the course of 12 years, in a home on Sullivan Street in DePere, was something profoundly different. And the fact that it took 12 years before the full scope of what had happened inside that home was formally documented and prosecuted is itself one of the most disturbing elements of this case. The investigation into the Windey household formally began on February 12, 2018, when DePere police assigned a sergeant to investigate reports of possible abuse at the home. Those reports had been triggered by a physical altercation in the house, one that occurred after the 3 adopted children who still lived at home refused to attend church. Sharon Windey called police in connection with that altercation, apparently expecting that officers would side with the parents in a matter of household discipline. What happened instead was that investigators began to listen, really listen, to what those children had to say. And what they said changed everything. Investigators interviewed 3 adopted children, a girl aged 15, a girl aged 14, and a boy aged 15. What those three young people described was a household in which physical punishment, food control, psychological manipulation, and humiliation had been the defining features of their existence for as long as they could remember. A fourth child, a young woman who had been adopted by the Windeys and had left the household when she turned 18, was also interviewed, and she provided consistent accounts of similar experiences during her years in the home. The children described being punched, being choked, being spanked with a force that went beyond any recognizable standard of corrective discipline, being thrown against walls, having their hair pulled, being subjected to exercise punishments and food-based punishments that were designed not to correct behavior, but to control and diminish. The 42-page criminal complaint that emerged from the investigation described the evidence as overwhelming and noted that since 2006, 12 years earlier, there had been Child Protective Services referrals, police contacts, and reports from school officials and teachers about the children in the Windey home experiencing physical and emotional harm. 12 years of signals, 12 years of reports, 12 years of a family that, by the account of the criminal complaint, had convinced the systems around it that what happened inside was discipline rather than abuse, that the children were, as Sharon Windey would testify at her trial, manipulative and disobedient and in need of firm correction. Some of the specific allegations that emerged from the criminal complaint were particularly difficult to process. The children described a food punishment that involved forcing them to eat bowl after bowl of oatmeal, 3 meals a day of oatmeal, prepared not out of nutritional necessity, but as a form of control. The kitchen cabinets, the freezer, and the pantry were kept locked, so the children could not access food independently. The boy in the household once became ill while being forced to eat oatmeal and vomited. Donald Windey, according to the complaint, made him eat the vomit along with the oatmeal and told him, in a statement that investigators noted in the complaint, that people were dying in Africa and that he needed to eat what was in front of him. One of the girls described being placed in a chokehold by Sharon Windey and lifted off the ground. Another child described being required to stand on one foot in their underwear as part of a religious prayer ritual and being struck with a belt if they lost their balance and put their foot down. The children described Donald telling them that he was hearing voices and seeing demons, and that those supernatural directives were guiding his treatment of them. The children said that they had told counselors, therapists, and teachers what was happening in the house. They had, for years, reached out to the adults in their lives outside the home and described what they were experiencing. Police had been called to the Windey house before, and yet, each time, the intervention had not risen to the level of formal charges. One of the children told investigators that when officers had visited the home on a prior occasion, they had told the children that their house did not look like a typical house for abuse because the children were well-fed and attended a good school. That detail, the assumption that a well-appointed house cannot be a house of harm, that children who attend good schools and eat regular meals cannot simultaneously be children experiencing abuse, is one of the most important lessons embedded in this case. Abuse does not require visible poverty. It does not require a household in observable disorder. It can exist, and it can persist for over a decade, inside a home that presents a completely different face to the outside world. Sharon Windey was tried before a jury in Brown County Circuit Court in November of 2019, a 6-day trial during which she took the stand and told the jury that her children were lying. She told them there were threads of truth in the allegations, but that a lot of this stuff was just being fabricated. The jury was not persuaded. On November 18, 2019, they returned guilty verdicts on 8 of 12 counts, including 3 counts of child abuse involving intentional harm, 1 count of strangulation and suffocation, and 4 counts of causing mental harm to a child. Sharon Windey put her head on the table and wept as the verdicts were read. On January 15, 2020, she was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 4 years of extended supervision. Donald Windey, who chose a judge trial rather than a jury trial, was found guilty on 8 counts including repeated acts of sexual harm against a child. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Their biological son, Stephen Windey, was sentenced to 18 months on probation for his role in the abuse. He had been described by the children as a third parent who participated in physical enforcement. Judge John Zakowski's words at Donald Windey's sentencing hearing were striking in their honesty and their reach beyond the individual defendants. He said that the Windeys, who believed in corporal punishment, should never have been permitted to foster or adopt children in the first place. This should have been red flagged, he said. And then the Windeys wouldn't have been put in that situation. The kids would have been spared. The system failed. It's a tragedy of immense proportions. A judge saying that. A judge acknowledging, from the bench, that the system failed. Not only the Windeys, but the system, the adoption process, the oversight mechanisms, the CPS referral protocols, the school officials who heard what children said and did not escalate. All of it. A tragedy of immense proportions. The 4 adopted children of Sharon and Donald Windey are now adults. They carry with them the weight of a childhood that was defined not by safety and love but by fear, hunger, pain, and the shattering experience of reaching out for help, repeatedly, over years, and not being heard. They deserved better. Every child deserves better. And the lesson of the Windey case is that the systems built to protect children must be willing to look beyond the surface of a home, beyond the good school district and the full refrigerator, and listen, really listen, to what children are saying. If this story has moved you, please do not move on in silence. Like this video. Share this content with someone who works with children, who cares about child safety, who needs to be reminded that the warning signs of abuse do not always look the way we expect them to. Hit the notification bell. Be part of a community that refuses to look the other way. Case 8. Audrey Edmunds. October 16, 1995. Conviction overturned January 31, 2008. Waunakee, Wisconsin. Every case in this documentary has, until this point, been a story of confirmed wrongdoing, of adults whose actions or failures resulted in harm to children, of legal proceedings that arrived at verdicts reflecting that wrongdoing. Case 8 is different. It is a story that begins with a tragedy, moves through a conviction, and arrives, over a decade later, at a conclusion that forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The possibility that the justice system, acting in good faith on the best available science, can still reach the wrong outcome. And that when it does, the person who pays the price is not an abstraction, but a mother, a neighbor, a woman with 3 daughters who spent 12 years of her life incarcerated for something that evolving medical science would ultimately conclude she may not have done. The case of Audrey Edmunds has become, over the decades since her conviction and its subsequent overturn, one of the most cited and most studied examples in the ongoing national and international conversation about the reliability of shaken baby syndrome as a forensic diagnosis. It is a case that lives at the intersection of criminal law, forensic science, wrongful conviction research, and child welfare policy. And it begins, as so many such cases do, with a tragedy that was real, undeniable, and heartbreaking regardless of who bore responsibility for it. On October 16, 1995, a 7-month-old girl named Natalie Beard was dropped off at the home of Audrey Edmunds in Waunakee, Wisconsin. Audrey was 34 years old, a stay-at-home mother of 2 daughters who ran an in-home childcare operation for families in her neighborhood. She was pregnant with her 3rd child. She was described by friends and neighbors as patient, warm, experienced with children, and deeply committed to the children in her care. Natalie Beard's mother, Cindy, mentioned on the morning of drop-off that Natalie had been a bit fussy and had taken only half of her bottle, but that otherwise she seemed normal. What happened during the course of that morning is a matter of profound and sustained legal and medical dispute. What is documented is this. Approximately an hour after Natalie was dropped off, Audrey Edmunds summoned her neighbor and called 911. When paramedics arrived at the Edmunds home, they found the infant with fixed and dilated pupils, struggling to breathe. She was transported to a hospital in Madison, where she passed away that evening. An autopsy conducted on Natalie Beard revealed extensive brain damage, including significant retinal hemorrhaging and retinal folds, injuries to the eyes consistent with, according to the forensic understanding of the time, violent shaking. A forensic pathologist determined the cause of passing to be shaken baby syndrome, or SBS, a diagnosis that, in 1995, was considered by mainstream medical experts to be unambiguous and reliable. The theory of SBS held that a specific triad of symptoms, brain swelling, subdural hemorrhage, and retinal hemorrhaging, could only be caused by violent shaking, and that an infant suffering these injuries would become immediately and obviously unresponsive. This meant that whoever was with the child at the moment of incapacitation was, necessarily, responsible. Audrey Edmunds had been the last adult with Natalie Beard before she became unresponsive. In the forensic logic of 1995, that made her responsible. On March 19, 1996, Audrey Edmunds was charged with first-degree reckless homicide. She maintained her innocence completely and consistently from the first moment she was interviewed through every subsequent legal proceeding. At her trial in December of 1996, the prosecution presented multiple medical experts who testified, with confident precision, that Natalie had been violently shaken and that the injury had occurred immediately before her collapse. Audrey's defense team found a single expert willing to testify that the injury could have occurred earlier, before Natalie was even in Edmunds' care. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On November 26, 1996, they returned a verdict of guilty. Judge Daniel Moser sentenced Audrey Edmunds to 18 years in prison. The conviction devastated her community. Friends and neighbors who had known Audrey for years, who had seen her with children, who had dropped their own children off at her home, who had watched her exercise patience and warmth in situations where a less committed caregiver might have struggled, could not reconcile the verdict with the person they knew. One neighbor told the Madison Capital Times, "She is such a warm and caring person. I've seen her in some stressful situations and been impressed with how she dealt with them. There's just no way Audrey could have done something like this." Another was quoted in Madison magazine as saying, "I never, ever even considered she might have done it." Audrey Edmunds served the years that followed with what was described by prison authorities as model behavior. She was denied parole in 2001 despite that exemplary record, because the parole board deemed her unrepentant. Unrepentant because she refused to admit guilt for something she maintained she had not done. She continued to maintain her innocence. She continued to write to her daughters. She continued, against extraordinary odds, to fight for a day that her defenders believed would eventually come. The turning point arrived through the work of Keith Finley, a law professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-founder of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. Finley had been approached by a doctor at UW Hospital who had been troubled by Edmunds' conviction and believed that some of the medical testimony presented at trial was erroneous. Finley began to investigate, and what he found was that by the early 2000s, the mainstream medical understanding of shaken baby syndrome had undergone a significant and substantive shift. Research published in the years since Edmunds' trial had revealed that the triad of symptoms once considered diagnostic proof of violent shaking, the brain swelling, the subdural hemorrhage, the retinal hemorrhaging, could in fact be caused by a wide range of other factors. Seizures, infections, ear infections that spread to the brain, old injuries, congenital defects. The scientific community was no longer in consensus. The certainty that had characterized the expert testimony at Audrey's trial had been, in the intervening decade, fundamentally undermined. Even more startling, the forensic pathologist who had performed Natalie Beard's autopsy, Dr. Robert Huntington III, testified at an evidentiary hearing in 2007 that he no longer believed his original conclusion was correct. He told the court that he no longer believed it was clear that Natalie had sustained her injuries immediately before her collapse. The expert whose findings had been central to the prosecution's case had changed his mind based on the new science. Trial Judge Moser denied Finley's motion for a new trial, but the Wisconsin Court of Appeals did not. On January 31, 2008, 12 years after Audrey Edmunds had been convicted, a unanimous appellate panel overturned her conviction and ordered a new trial. The court found that a shift in mainstream medical opinion had cast sufficient doubt on whether shaking could have caused Natalie Beard's fatal injuries. A jury, the court ruled, should have the opportunity to hear the competing scientific theories and decide again. 6 days later, Audrey Edmunds walked out of Burke Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, at 3 in the afternoon, blinking into a gray winter sky that she had not stood beneath as a free woman in nearly 12 years. Her mother and brother were there. A handful of friends who had braved a driving snowstorm to be present for that moment were there. She called her 3 daughters, teenagers by then, spending the day on a ski trip in Colorado, and they wept together on the phone. "It feels so good to be free," she said. "And to be out. Oh man, I can't tell you. It was wonderful." The Wisconsin Supreme Court subsequently declined to take up the state's appeal, letting the overturn stand by a 5-1 vote. The Dane County District Attorney's Office ultimately chose not to retry Audrey Edmunds. The charges were effectively concluded. She was free. What makes this case not simply a story of one woman's wrongful conviction, but a story of enormous systemic significance, is what Finley did with the lessons of Edmunds's case in the years that followed. He established the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin. He became a nationally recognized expert on the reliability problems inherent in shaken baby syndrome diagnoses. He took on case after case of men and women who had been convicted on similar evidence. And the national data reflects the reach of this problem. At least 21 people charged with crimes connected to SBS diagnoses have had their convictions overturned since 2019 alone. Natalie Beard's passing was real. The grief of her parents was real. The tragedy of that October morning in Waunakee was real. None of what followed, not the investigation, not the trial, not the conviction, not the fight for exoneration, erases the loss of that 7-month-old girl. But the story of Audrey Edmunds is a story that demands that we hold two truths simultaneously: that a child's passing demands justice, and that the pursuit of justice must be built on science that is reliable, honest about its limitations, and willing to evolve when new evidence emerges. Audrey Edmunds is now a mother of 3 grown daughters. She has written a book about her experience, titled "It Happened to Audrey." She has become an advocate for wrongful conviction reform and forensic science accountability. Her case, and the work of Keith Finley and the Wisconsin Innocence Project, continues to shape how courts and medical experts approach child injury cases across the country. This case is a testament to the extraordinary importance of not giving up, to the power of science to correct itself, and to the irreplaceable value of people who are willing to say, even when it is uncomfortable and even when it challenges convictions that have already been entered, we need to take another look. If this case moved you, if the complexity, the injustice, and the eventual vindication of Audrey Edmunds gave you something to think about, please like this video. Every person who subscribes to this channel is someone who believes that the truth matters, that justice matters, and that the stories behind the headlines deserve to be told carefully and completely. Hit the notification bell and stay with us. Case 9, Ashlee Martinson. March 7, 2015. Peel, Wisconsin, near Rhinelander. There are cases that refuse to fit neatly into the categories that the criminal justice system provides. Cases where the person who caused harm was themselves, for years, a person who experienced harm. Cases where the defendant and the victim exist in the same person's story, where the line between perpetrator and survivor is not a clean or comfortable one to draw. The case of Ashlee Martinson is that kind of case. It is a case that a judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, a community, and a nation all struggled to fully understand. And that struggle, more than the verdict itself, is perhaps the most honest measure of its significance. Ashlee and Rose Martinson was born on March 6, 1998. On March 7, 2015, the day after her 17th birthday, she was involved in the events that would result in the passing of 2 people and the beginning of a legal case that would draw international attention to a rural community in Oneida County, Wisconsin, and to the question of how the law should respond when a young person raised in a home of prolonged abuse takes a violent and irreversible action. The home in which Ashlee Martinson lived with her mother, Jennifer F. Ayers, and her stepfather, Thomas H. Tony Ayers, was located in Peel, a remote, sparsely populated township in the forests of northern Wisconsin, about 20 miles outside of Rhinelander. The family had moved there in the summer of 2014. Thomas Ayers, according to court documents, had specifically sought out large, secluded land, a remote property where he could hunt. He was, it emerged during the legal proceedings, a convicted felon and a domestic abuser who was not legally permitted to possess firearms. The account of life in that home, drawn from court documents, the statements of Ashlee Martinson, the testimony of her younger siblings, and the accounts of people who had known the family, was deeply troubling. Thomas Ayers was described, consistently and by multiple sources, as a man who administered physical punishment that crossed into harm, who verbally and emotionally controlled every member of the household, who struck his wife, struck his biological daughters, and on at least one occasion killed a puppy in front of the children. The girls, Ashlee's 3 younger stepsisters, were reportedly not allowed to have visitors, were required to account for their whereabouts at all times, and lived in a state of ongoing fear of their stepfather's moods and reactions. One of the children told investigators that Thomas Ayers had once struck and killed one of the family's German Shepherd puppies in front of the entire household. Ashlee told investigators that she had witnessed extensive physical harm directed at the other members of the family by her stepfather, though she reported that the abuse directed at her had been primarily verbal and emotional rather than physical. She also disclosed that she had experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a previous boyfriend of her mother, a period of harm that she said had lasted approximately 2 years and for which she had received no therapeutic support. On the night of March 6, 2015, Ashlee's 17th birthday, an argument erupted in the household. The precipitating issue was a relationship. Jennifer and Thomas Ayers had discovered that Ashlee was involved romantically with a 22-year-old man named Ryan Sisko. They had contacted Sisko directly and threatened legal consequences. In response, they revoked Ashlee's phone privileges and her access to the family car. That night, Ashlee posted on Facebook, "He's gonna kill her if she doesn't leave soon. I want to kill him so badly. Take one of his guns and blow his brains out." It was a post written in the heat of teenage rage by a young person who had been watching her mother and siblings experience harm for over a year, who had no therapeutic support, no family members outside the home who were equipped to help, and a stepfather whose behavior had created a constant atmosphere of threat and intimidation. Whether that post constituted a premeditated plan or an emotional outcry, that was a question the legal system would wrestle with for years. The following morning, March 7th, the household deteriorated further. Ashlee witnessed Thomas Ayers physically confronting her mother. Shortly afterward, she went to her room. She told investigators that she had retrieved a shotgun from the home with the intention of using it on herself, that she had reached a point of such despair that she was considering ending her own life. Before she could act on that intention, Thomas Ayers came to her bedroom door and began knocking. What happened next was described differently at different stages of the legal proceedings, as Ashlee's account evolved under the pressure of investigation and eventual legal counsel. What the court ultimately accepted, through Ashlee's guilty plea, was this. She fired the shotgun through the door, striking Thomas Ayers in the neck. She then fired again, striking him in the head. Thomas Ayers, 37 years old, did not survive. Jennifer Ayers, 40 years old, came to investigate the sound of the gunshots. In what followed, an encounter the details of which remain complicated and disputed, Jennifer Ayers was stabbed more than 30 times. She did not survive. Before leaving the house, Ashlee Martinson locked her 3 younger sisters, children younger than her, in a room with food and juice. She did not harm them. She then fled the state with her boyfriend. The 2 were located and arrested in Indiana. Investigators confirmed that the boyfriend had no involvement in the events that had taken place in the house. Ashlee Martinson was charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and false imprisonment. She entered an initial not guilty plea and subsequently explored a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. Ultimately, in March of 2016, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide. The distinction between first and second-degree homicide in this context reflected the jury's and the court's willingness to consider the context of provocation and mental state. On June 10, 2016, Ashlee Martinson, then 18 years old, was sentenced in Oneida County Circuit Court by Judge Michael Bloom. The prosecution had sought 40 years. The defense had argued for 8, pointing to the documented abuse in the household, Ashlee's trauma history, and her age at the time. Judge Bloom sentenced her to 23 years in prison, followed by 17 years of extended supervision. The defendant had a choice, Judge Bloom said. Even as he acknowledged that the home had been abusive, his ruling reflected the fundamental principle that the legal system, however much it accounts for context and mitigation, cannot permit violence as a sanctioned response to household abuse. It was a ruling that satisfied neither side completely, and that continues to be debated. Ashlee Martinson is currently incarcerated at Zakquita Correctional Institution in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. In subsequent years, she has filed motions seeking a reduction in her sentence. Those motions have been denied. In a September 2025 ruling, an Oneida County judge denied her most recent request for modification. She is expected to be released in 2038. In a remarkable and deeply human footnote to this case, Ashlee has reportedly told those who have spoken with her inside the institution that she feels happy and safe in prison, a statement that, rather than trivializing her incarceration, speaks to the extremity of what her life had been before it. She obtained her high school diploma while incarcerated. She has been described as a model inmate. Jennifer Ayers and Thomas Ayers both lost their lives in that house in Peel on March 7, 2015. Jennifer Ayers was a 40-year-old mother who had, by all accounts, struggled with and suffered from the same household dynamics that her daughter experienced. Thomas Ayers was a man whose documented history of harm to those around him set in motion a chain of events that destroyed his family and took multiple lives. The case of Ashlee Martinson is a case about what happens to children who grow up in homes where harm is constant, where help is unavailable, and where the systems designed to intervene are never given the information they need. It is a case about the urgent, irreplaceable importance of trauma-informed support for young people before they reach a breaking point that changes everything forever. The three younger sisters of Ashlee Martinson survived. They have been cared for by the child welfare system. Their lives continue. And somewhere in those lives, there is the hope, fragile but real, of something better than what they were given in that remote house in Peel. If this story has left you thinking about the children in your own community who may be living in fear, who may be reaching out in ways that aren't always obvious, please reach out to the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-4-A-CHILD. Available every hour of every day. Every call matters. And please, like this video. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The bell icon is right there. Every one of you who subscribes is a person who cares about justice and truth. Thank you. Case 10, Michaela Clerc. June 4, 2007. Sentenced September 9, 2008. Portage, Wisconsin. Some cases emerge from the files of law enforcement carrying a weight that is difficult to fully process. A weight drawn not from a single act, or even from a series of acts, but from the sheer accumulation of what a group of human beings was willing to do to one of the most defenseless people imaginable, a child. An 11-year-old boy, in a house in a quiet Wisconsin city, while the rest of the world went about its normal business. While no one outside those walls knew. While the days passed, and the harm continued, and the little boy endured. The case that came to be known publicly as the Garland case is that kind of case. It involves multiple defendants, a web of relationships that cross state lines, a child welfare system that failed to connect the dots in time, and an 11-year-old boy whose survival, when police finally reached him in the summer of 2007, was described by the physicians who treated him as nothing short of extraordinary. He had been near death. His body had been through things that human beings are not supposed to endure. And among the people responsible for what happened to him was a young woman named Michaela Clerc, who, in September of 2008, stood before a Columbia County Circuit Court judge and was sentenced to 37 years in prison. To understand who Michaela Clerc was and what her role in this case represented, it is necessary to understand the broader context of the Garland case, because it is not a story with a single villain or a single setting. It is a story that begins in Florida, travels across multiple states, and ends in Portage, Wisconsin, a city of approximately 9,000 people located about 40 miles north of Madison, which describes itself with a certain quiet civic pride as where the North begins. The central figure around whom this case orbits, the person whose suffering defined it, and whose passing in the early morning hours of June 4, 2007 gave it its legal name, was a 36-year-old woman named Tammy Garland. Tammy had two children, a 15-year-old daughter named Felicia May, and a son who was 11 years old at the time of the events in Portage. Tammy also had a former romantic partner, a young woman named Michaela Clerc, who was 20 years old at the time of the events that unfolded in that rented house on West Oneida Street. The group that converged on Portage in February of 2007 had the superficial appearance of a traveling household, a group of people connected by relationships and circumstances, moving from state to state. In reality, investigators would determine that the group was bound together by something more sinister. A roving criminal enterprise that included identity fraud, outstanding warrants, and a fugitive profile that stretched from Florida to Kentucky to Colorado. Leading that group, according to prosecutors, were Candace Clerc, 23 years old, and her boyfriend, Michael Sisk, 25 years old. Clerc had, in Florida, abducted her 2-year-old daughter from foster care in violation of a court order. She was a wanted fugitive. Sisk was wanted in Colorado for failing to return to jail after a work release period. The group had chosen to come to Portage, had chosen Wisconsin, according to court documents, because they wanted to see snow. The house they rented on West Oneida Street became, over the course of the months that followed, a place of escalating cruelty directed at Tammy Garland and her son. The precise dynamics of what shifted within that household, what transformed a group of interconnected adults into something that prosecutors described as an actively harmful environment for the most vulnerable people inside it, were a matter of significant investigation and trial testimony. Candace Clerc later told reporters in jailhouse interviews that the group had turned on Tammy Garland after she made a disclosure that enraged Michael Sisk. Whatever the trigger, the consequences were catastrophic. The boy, Tammy's son, 11 years old, became one of the primary targets of the harm that followed. According to the criminal complaint, he was subjected to a sustained and escalating pattern of physical harm that included being struck with an extension cord, being struck with a golf club, being struck with a paddle, and being scalded with hot water. The criminal complaint documented that Michaela Clerc participated in the scalding incidents. She admitted to holding the bathroom door shut during at least one scalding episode to prevent the younger children from being injured by the hot water. She admitted to participating in what the complaint described as physical punishment directed at the boy on approximately 12 occasions. She kicked Tammy Garland. She was present in the bathroom when Tammy Garland lost consciousness and did not survive. The pediatrician who treated the boy upon his rescue, Dr. Barbara Knox, testified that he had sustained burns across 40% of his body. He had lost 4 fingers on one hand and 3 toes on one foot as a result of the injuries he sustained. He had been locked in a closet. He was found by police in that closet, blood-streaked, severely malnourished, barely alive, when officers arrived at the West Oneida Street house on June 15, 2007, following up on a missing child tip that had originated in Florida regarding Candace Clerc's abducted daughter. When officers entered that house, what they found was a scene that would challenge the most experienced investigators. 3 young children, Clerc's daughters, including the abducted 2-year-old, were also in the residence. Tammy Garland was not visible. Felicia May, the 15-year-old daughter, was there. And Michaela Clerc was there, along with Clerc and Sisk. It was the search for a 2-year-old abducted child in Florida that led officers to a house where a mother had been laid to rest in the backyard, and her 11-year-old son was locked in a closet fighting for his life. Tammy Garland's body was found buried in a shallow grave in the backyard of the house the following day, after a search warrant was obtained. An autopsy determined that her probable cause of passing was manual strangulation. She had been harmed and confined alongside her son in the final days of her life. The complaint documented that she had been the only person in the house who had tried to help her son, placing cream on his wounds, attempting to provide comfort in conditions that prevented her from doing more. The legal proceedings that followed involved all 3 adult defendants accepting plea deals. Michaela Clerc pleaded no contest to 4 charges: mayhem, child abuse, causing mental harm to a child, and false imprisonment. On September 9, 2008, Columbia County Circuit Court Judge Alan White sentenced her to 37 years in prison, 25 years for the mayhem charge alone, with additional years for the remaining counts running consecutively. Judge White stated explicitly in his sentencing remarks that Clerc had failed to protect the boy from egregious harm and had actively participated in it. He described the wounds documented on the child's body as the most egregious injuries I have seen. Candace Clerc received 55 years. Michael Sisk received 63 years. Felicia May Garland's case was transferred to the juvenile court system, where proceedings are confidential. The boy, whose full name has never been publicly released, in keeping with protective standards for child victims, attended the sentencing hearing of Michaela Clerc. He was 12 years old by then. He sat in the front row of the courtroom in a striped polo shirt and khakis and sneakers, and he had submitted a letter to the judge through his guardian ad litem. The guardian read it aloud to the court. "I am writing this to you because I want Michaela to go to jail," the letter said. "About 12 times she tied me up and put me in the tub and burned me. I never thought Michaela could be mean to my mom and me." The courtroom fell silent. A 12-year-old boy, in clean clothes, asking a judge to hold the person accountable who had done those things to him. A 12-year-old boy who had survived what Dr. Knox described as the most severe abuse she had ever witnessed in a child. A 12-year-old boy who had watched his mother buried in the backyard of a rented house in Wisconsin because a group of adults had decided, in whatever darkness of their combined psychology, that his mother's life was disposable. Judge White also ordered that Michaela Clerc was to have no contact, ever, with the boy or his family. He ordered restitution, and he made absolutely clear that the sentence he was imposing reflected the full gravity of what had occurred in that house. The Garland case is, in many ways, the case that most fully illustrates the intersection of every theme that runs through this documentary. The vulnerability of children who cannot protect themselves, the terrifying consequences when adults tasked with care choose harm instead, the extraordinary importance of child welfare systems that can connect information across state lines, and the resilience of survivors who, against odds that should have made survival impossible, endure. The boy is alive. Wherever he is today, now an adult in his 20s, with a life that stretches far beyond the closet on West Oneida Street, he survived. Against every odd, he survived. And the justice system, however imperfectly and however long after the fact, delivered a reckoning. Tammy Garland deserved to live. Her son deserved a childhood. And the state of Wisconsin, through the persistence of its investigators and prosecutors, ensured that the people responsible for what happened in that Portage house faced the fullest consequence the law could provide. To every survivor of the cases documented in this film, you are seen. You are not forgotten. Your stories matter, and the world is better, is safer, is more aware, because they have been told. This has been the Cold Case Time documentary. 10 heartbreaking Wisconsin cases, women, accountability, and the fight for justice. Every case in this film represents a real person who experienced real harm, and a real legal system that was called upon to respond. We have done our best to honor the complexity of each story, to present the facts as they exist in the public legal record, and to tell these stories with the seriousness and dignity that every victim deserves. If any of the content in this documentary has raised concerns for you about a child in your community, please do not wait. Contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. That is 1-800-422-4453. Available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Free, confidential, and staffed by trained crisis counselors. Every call can make a difference. If you found this documentary valuable, if you believe these stories deserve to be heard and these victims deserve to be remembered, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts so you never miss another story. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who cares about justice. We are a community built on the belief that truth matters, that accountability matters, and that every single person whose story appears in this film, every victim, every survivor, every child, matters more than words can adequately express. We will see you in the next one.